Shalom, everyone. I'm Ron Cantor. I'm the president of Shalanu TV, as well as the director of Messiah's Mandate. And tonight we're going to have a special time of sharing regarding International Holocaust Memorial Day. That is today, January 27th, where we focus on remembering the 6 million Jewish people who perished in the Holocaust. In Israel, we actually have our own Remembrance Day, which is very different, very focused, typically in April. It changes on the Gregorian calendar because it's according to the Hebrew calendar. But it's a day when all the TV channels are off. They're playing movies about the Holocaust. They're playing documentaries about survivors. It's a really special time in Israel. And the reason we remember is so that this could never happen again. Now, we're living in an age now where Holocaust denial is becoming more and more popular. And the further we get from 1938, 39 to 1945, these lies are going to continue to be spread, that the Holocaust didn't really happen, or not really that many people died. But we do know, and thankfully, people like Steven Spielberg, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., they have recorded thousands of firsthand testimony regarding what happened in the Holocaust. Now, that's important because the Holocaust survivors, those folks, that group is becoming smaller and smaller as each one passes away. Right now, in the world, there are only about 200,000 survivors left. There were 11 million Jews in Europe, 6 million perished. So of those 5 million that survived the Holocaust, only 200,000 remain with us today. 100,000 are in Israel, the other 100,000 spread throughout the world. So we want to take some time tonight. I want to share some stories, some theology, if you will. One of the main things I really want to do today is I want to raise funds for Holocaust survivors in Israel. And friends, let me just be honest with you. When we raise funds for Holocaust survivors in Israel, we make sure those funds go to Holocaust survivors in Israel. Right now, of those 100,000, they are having a very, very difficult time. They're having a difficult time because we're still in the midst of COVID-19. This virus has wreaked havoc on Israel. While we have done an amazing job of administering the vaccination, about 46%, I'm told, of Israel's population have received the vaccination. Our infection rates are going through the sky. Right now, we're averaging about 10,000 new infections a day, and we're a tiny country. That would be almost 400,000 a day in America. And so those who are the most vulnerable are the elderly and the Holocaust survivors. Every one of them is in that category of being 70 years old, 80 years old, 90 years old, and they're alone, they're hurting, they need food, they need fruits and vegetables. So I'm believing God that tonight during this broadcast, we are going to raise $10,000, and we're going to use those funds to make sure that these people have food and groceries. We are going to reach out to them. You have my word that is where these funds will go. So the address is on the screen there, standwithmmi.org. MMI is our ministry, Messiah's Mandate. And the very first category you'll see when you go there is for Holocaust survivors. So I want to encourage you to give. I'm not going to spend a lot. I'm going to leave the graphic up there during the broadcast for the most part, but I want to get into the content today. But again, let's believe God for those funds so that we can be a blessing to them. So in 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Europe during a time where they had been gone through a very difficult economic time. And when that happens, typically in nations, it's the Jewish people who are blamed. I'm sure you've noticed that throughout history. Here's something you may not know, is that the Jewish people have suffered about 52 attempted genocides. 52 times people outside of Israel had tried to eliminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. That is the plan of Satan. You understand, ever since God prophesied that through Abraham, through his seed, that he would be a blessing to the whole world. Satan has made Abraham and his seed an enemy. God said to Abraham, anyone who blesses you, I will bless. Anyone who curses you, I will curse. And through your seed, I will bless the whole earth. And we know that that is primarily fulfilled in Yeshua the Messiah. So the enemy has made an enemy of the Jewish people. He also knows that Jerusalem is, Zion means signpost. Jerusalem, Zion, it's a signpost for the end times. You can look to Israel and know where we are in terms of God's economy, God's clock. And now that Israel is a nation, he tried so hard to prevent Israel from becoming a nation. He has tried so hard to keep Jerusalem out of the hands of the Jewish people. He tried so hard to keep 1 million Russian Jews locked up in the former Soviet Union. But God has conquered each and every time. Israel is a nation. Jerusalem is the capital. Over 1 million Russian-speaking Jews have come back to Israel. And so the enemy has failed over and over again, but he continues to try and make God a liar. God said that I will be faithful to my covenant with the Jewish people as long as the sun shines. This is Jeremiah 31, 35 to 37. The sun shines, the moon gives its light, the stars are in the sky. I will continue to bless Israel. Israel will continue to be a nation before me. So the enemy has failed, but he hates the Jewish people. And that's why you have to fight against anti-Semitism. If you are a believer in Yeshua, don't say, I could never do what the people of Europe did, because many of them were professing believers and they turned in their neighbors. Some became killers. Some became Nazis, people who were once professing believers in Jesus out of fear, or maybe they really got caught up in the lie that the Jews were to blame. And so Hitler, over a period of many years, continued to stir up anti-Semitism until it all came to a tipping point on November 9th and 10th of 1938. That's the night we call Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass. Hundreds of Jewish owned stores where people threw bricks through them. They sprayed graffiti on them. About 100 Jewish people died that night over those 2 nights. And that is when the Nazis began to collect the Jewish people little by little and send them to concentration camps. And of course, you know what happened after that. They then sent them to these concentration camps all over Germany. We know we often think of just Auschwitz or Dachau, but there were hundreds of concentration camps. And many of those Jewish people, 6 million of them, were killed. And so we have to ask ourselves today, what can we do to continue to reach out to those people? When I get further on in the broadcast, I want to open up to Matthew 25 and answer this question. Does the Bible speak about survivors of the Holocaust? Let me just say, yes, I believe that it does. And I'm going to show you in just a minute. I want to share a little bit more with you, a couple stories with you. And I know that the topic of the Holocaust can be extremely heavy, right? And if you watch movies like Schindler's List, there's incredible heaviness, and rightly so. I mean, the idea of 6 million people over just a few years being systematically murdered is heavy. By the way, somebody wrote on my Facebook today, when they saw that we were going to do this broadcast, they said, are you just going to talk about the Jewish people who died? Are you going to talk about the millions of others who also perished? And I wrote back a snarky comment. I am just human after all. And I said, yes, that's what we'll be doing. Just the 6 million Jews. And then I deleted the comment because I felt bad. But understand, of course, we care about everyone who perished during that time, during World War II. But why do we focus on the Jewish people specifically? Because they were the only nation, if you will, the only people group that Hitler sought to eliminate from the face of the earth. These are the chosen people of God that, because of that moniker, chosen people, Am Nivchar in Hebrew, because of that, we have suffered over and over and over, century throughout century, from Haman to Hitler, Saddam Hussein, under Stalin, we have suffered and suffered. So yes, we don't apologize that we take 1 day a year and encourage the international community to remember specifically the Jewish people who died in the Holocaust. Now, having said that, it is a heavy time. I want to share with you a couple stories that aren't so heavy, that are kind of healing in nature, and then we're going to get into the scriptures. I don't want to keep you very long tonight. Again, you can see the website below me, standwithmmi.org. The very first category that should come up is Holocaust survivors. If not, click in the menu. We want to raise $10,000 tonight. We want to give it to Holocaust survivors in Israel. We want to brighten up their day. We want to let them know that believers around the world care about them as they're suffering through this virus. They're lonely. They're in their apartments all over Israel. They're not having human contact. In fact, the entire country right now is on lockdown. But we work with ministries in the land, our friends, our partners that are going to get food, vegetables, fruits to the Holocaust survivors. So let me encourage you today, make a generous donation for these precious, precious Holocaust survivors in their final years on earth. Now, in Israel in 1945 to 1948, and even after, Holocaust survivors began to pour into the nation, even before Israel was officially rebirthed in 1948. Now, when these survivors came back to Israel, there was a lot of confusion from the native-born Israelis. My wife is a native-born Israeli. They're born fighters. The native-born Israeli, they're ready to die for their nation. Everyone goes to the army. Everyone is a patriotic for the state of Israel. They understand the very difficult situation that they live in, that every day is precious. And so one of the things they could not understand, because again, the Israelis, back in the 40s, they were fighting almost every day. Of course, the War of Independence, many did die as they fought for the independence of the nation of Israel. They could not understand how these Holocaust survivors did not fight Hitler, how they didn't stand up for themselves, how they didn't risk their life, why they weren't willing to fight back. And of course, one of the answers is it happened little by little. Nobody really believed it. The Jews of Europe, they were comfortable, they were successful. And many of these same Jews were the ones that moved to Israel out of that comfort, and they became farmers and fighters. That's the chalutzim. That's the Hebrew word for the pioneers of Israel. They were farmers and fighters. By day they farmed, by night they fought. And they couldn't understand, and you can only imagine the physical condition in which these people arrived in Israel, emaciated, half of their former selves. And so the Israelis, they were confused, and they never really talked about it much. But it was this underlying tension and even judgment against the survivors. Well, this goes on for some time. And part of the problem is that the survivors, almost to a man, to a woman, they didn't talk about the Holocaust. And you can imagine why. It was horrifying. Women being raped, people being murdered, people becoming slaves, going to concentration camps. And it went on year after year. And when you think about the death marches, where after going through that for 5-6 years, then marching in the snow barefoot, many of them died. I mean, just story after story. These people, they couldn't talk about it until one day. Something very interesting happened. Excuse me. In 1961, the Mossad, the famous Israeli spy agency, they had gotten intelligence that Adolf Eichmann, the famous architect of the final solution, the idea that these 6 million Jews should be murdered, really they wanted to murder all the Jews of Europe, that he was living a very quiet life in Argentina. After the war, he was somehow smuggled out of Germany, and he lived just a normal life in Argentina, as if he was not a mass murderer, just a normal granddad. Went to work, came home, and we had intelligence that he was there. The Mossad sent about 5 or 6 agents. They found him as he was getting off his bus to come home from work one day. This is now 16 years after the end of the Holocaust. he is kidnapped by them. He knows immediately that who it is that found him. And he begins to utter the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. This is the most sacred prayer in Judaism. And he recites it, and the Mossad agents, angels as well, they couldn't understand that this grandfather many of them literally became nauseous and lost it physically because they wanted to find a monster, and they found an old man. Nevertheless, they drugged him and they took him back to Israel on an El Al commercial flight. And they get back to Israel, and suddenly it's announced all over the country that they have captured Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution. And so Eichmann is taken into custody in Israel. He's going to be put on trial. And Israel decided that they were going to let everybody who wanted to testify at his trial. And then something amazing happened. Suddenly, after over a decade, the Holocaust survivors, they began to tell their stories. They began to sit down with their children and their grandchildren. They began to share their stories, their harrowing stories, some heroic stories about the death that they suffered, the pain they encountered. And something happened during the trial of Adolf Eichmann. The man who wanted to kill every single Jew ended up becoming responsible for an incredible healing in the nation of Israel between the native-born Israeli fighters and the Holocaust survivors. Suddenly there were articles being printed in the newspaper, in magazines, people opening up, the floodgates opened up, and people began to tell their story. And that became, again, I wasn't even alive at the time. That was 4 years before I was born, but that became a moment of healing for the Jewish nation. Another story I want to share with you is about it's a story of a man by the name of Peter. And Peter was Peter van Woerden. And Peter van Woerden, he was the nephew of Corrie ten Boom. Who was Corrie ten Boom? Most of you know, I assume, I hope. Corrie ten Boom was the daughter of, what was this? Was it Helmut ten Boom? Casper ten Boom, who hid Jewish people in his home during the Holocaust. Of course, many of you have seen the movie, The Hiding Place, and people talk about Corrie ten Boom. They talk about Casper ten Boom. Nobody talks about Peter. Poor, sweet Peter, her nephew. Peter was a runner. Now, let me just tell you what he did before he became a runner. This is in the midst of the Holocaust I'm just going to read you from a blog I found. Just one second. Here it is. Okay. So Peter van Woerden, he's Corrie ten's nephew, and he began his career in the Dutch underground in 1942. He was the organist of the Reformed Church in Velsen and was a regular and was playing on this particular morning one Sunday, and he recounts, quote, "On this particular Sunday, as I sat and mused, I suddenly realized that exactly 2 years before, on the 10th of May, the Nazi invasion of Holland had begun. As I looked over the congregation, I decided that something should be done. Something on this morning, this Sunday morning, to demonstrate that we were still real Dutchmen at heart. Something to express our faith and our hope in a day of victory when we would again be free people." The sermon was over. I pulled extra stops out of the organ, then firmly and distinctly played the chords of the Wilhelmus, which is the Dutch national anthem. There was a rustling downstairs. By the way, I'm sure it was quite illegal to play that. There was a rustling downstairs. People stood to their feet. One voice began to sing. One voice began to sing, and then others. Soon, like a mighty sea, the glorious old hymn rolled forth from the overflowing hearts of hundreds of Hollanders as tears streamed down their faces. For that one moment, we were a free people in the midst of a dark world of oppression and persecution. That gesture, that amazing, awesome, heroic gesture landed Peter in prison, where in turn he experienced for the first time in his life a deep hunger for God. After years in the church, he actually met the Messiah and was truly born again. And this prepared him for what would happen later. Now, just a second. Now, Peter, many years later, now in his 80s, during the Holocaust, he was a runner. That meant that he would smuggle these Jewish people that were hiding in the home of Corrie ten Boom. He would smuggle them from one place to another to meet another runner, ultimately getting them to safety, often the shores of what would soon be the nation of Israel. Well, Peter, who obviously loved Israel his entire life, in the 90s, late 90s, he was touring Israel with, I think he was with a singing group. I've heard a few different versions of this, but he was part of a singing choir in Jerusalem. And during this particular night, well, let me just read it to you. Many of you have heard the story of Corrie ten Boom. Miss ten Boom is the author of The Hiding Place, the true story of faith and heroism set in Haarlem, Holland during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. The Hiding Place was made into a movie. During those horrific days of Nazi occupation, Peter van Woerden also boldly exercised his faith. He was the nephew. He transported many Jewish children under the cover of darkness from their home in Haarlem to other secret hiding places where they were saved from the Nazis. Peter, too, was eventually caught and spent several months in a concentration camp. I learned that many years later, I'm quoting from a blog, I learned that many years later, after the war, I believe it was in the early 70s, not the 90s, Peter van Woerden and his family were traveling in Israel. Again, I heard it was a choir that they were singing. He suffered a massive heart attack during this tour and was rushed to Hadassah's famous hospital in Jerusalem. The surgeon on call that day skillfully saved Peter's life in the emergency surgery. As he recuperated, Peter expressed gratitude to the medical staff. When they found out about Peter's relation to the ten Boom family, they talked about the Holocaust and Peter's activity during these terrible times. The medical personnel were full of questions, and they were fascinated by this faithful man and his family's effort to thwart the Nazis and protect innocent Jews. As the conversation continues, the surgeon began to cry, and so did Peter. Why? Because as they compared notes, they realized that this surgeon was one of the children that Peter van Woerden smuggled to safety. Now think about that. The economy of God, the grace of God, the power of God, the author of history. He enabled Peter to save this young boy's life so that many years later, when this man's life needed saving, it would be this survivor who became a doctor that would perform life-saving surgery on Peter. So, hallelujah. Praise God. Even in the midst of incredible tragedy, God was at work. And of course, we all know the story of Schindler's List, where Oskar Schindler, he basically started a fake business that was making fake bombs using Jewish people who had been arrested in concentration camps, and he ended up saving nearly, I think, 1,000 lives, 1,000 souls during that time. So on this Holocaust Remembrance Day, I do want to focus on those positive stories. We don't ever want to forget the horror that happened. There are amazing books you can read about. One of them is Night by Elie Wiesel. I would also encourage you to read, let's see, let me get the title of this book. It is written, I know, by Dan Kurtzman, Warsaw Uprising. Let's see if we can. It's called The Bravest Battle, the 28 Days of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. One of the best books I've ever read in my life. Again, that's Dan Kurtzman, The Bravest Battle, The 28 Days of the Warsaw Ghetto. I want you to go in your Bibles, if you will, to Matthew chapter 25. I want us to open up our Bibles to Matthew 25. In Matthew 25, we find the story of the sheep and the goats. I said earlier at the beginning of the broadcast, and again, we are raising funds tonight. You can see the, and listen, when I mention raising funds, don't stop watching. God has given us resource. These funds don't go to me. We're going to help Holocaust survivors. Do you understand? This is an amazing opportunity that we have to be a blessing to them during this time, during COVID-19, when they're locked up in their homes and they're really cut off from the outside world. And many of them need food. They need groceries. We're going to help them. So go to standwithmmi.org. The first category on our menu is Holocaust survivors. Give a generous gift today so we can be a blessing to them. I said at the beginning of the broadcast that we were going to talk about whether or not we can find Holocaust survivors in the Bible. So I believe we can. Go to Matthew chapter 25. It's the prophecy, not the parable. It's not a parable. It's a prophecy from Yeshua about the sheep and the goats. Now, I have a certain take on this. I shared this with a Hebrew scholar the other day, and to my shock, he said this was the best, most clear breakdown of this. He got it from my book, Birth Pangs, breakdown that he'd ever seen. And this guy's a lot smarter than me. So I was very honored and very blessed. But let me share with you what I shared with him. So if you look at Matthew 25, Yeshua has gathered together. And we have to ask ourselves, when does this take place? Well, it takes place when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him. So it's the second coming. It's what we see in Revelation 19 when he comes down from heaven on a white horse. When he lands on the Mount of Olives, Zechariah chapter 14, and he is about to set up his kingdom. Now, where is this? It is not in Moscow or Washington. It says he will sit on his glorious throne, which will be in Jerusalem, according to Zechariah 14:3. Now, who's invited to this? It says the survivors of the nations. In the Old Covenant, when the Bible uses the word nations, in Greek it's ethnos, in Hebrew it's goyim, it excludes Israel. I'm just going to read from what I wrote. So when God refers to the nations, it means all the nations besides Israel. So the Old Testament tends to speak of Israel and the nations. So when God speaks in Psalm 67 about the light of God shining on Israel, so the nations may be known, that was the calling of Israel, to be light to or for the nations. So there's Israel in the nations. So Yeshua is in Israel and he is addressing the nations. Now, Yeshua has come back, we know, in answer to the cry of his people, just like when God sent Moses. When God sent Moses, he said, I've heard the cry of my people in Egypt. It's a very interesting thing. If you look at Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, not everybody agrees with me on this, but it says, every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And it says, and the nations of the world will mourn for them. Well, actually, it says, the tribes of the land will mourn. Now, why is that significant? Because in Hebrew, we typically, the 12 tribes of Israel, and we typically refer to Israel. If I tell somebody in Israel that I'm going to be coming home, or if they call me up and they want to know, hey, Ron, are you in Israel? They say, Ata ba'aretz, are you in the land? They don't say, are you in Israel? They say, are you in the land? So I believe it's going to be the tribes of Israel that have this mass revelation and mourn Zechariah 12 for the one whom they have pierced. That's what John is drawing from in Revelation 1:7. So you have Israel and the nations. Now he has, hang on just a second. And then it speaks in Zechariah 14:16 about the survivors of the nation having to come to Jerusalem year after year, right? You've read that? So at the second coming, there's going to be survivors. And these people from the nations, the Goyim, they will come and they will worship the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. But on that first one they come to, I believe it's going to be a feast of well, I don't believe it. It says it right there in Zechariah 14 that they'll come for the Feast of Tabernacles. But I believe that Matthew 25, as the nations come to worship Jesus in Jerusalem, that is the Feast of Tabernacles, of which Zechariah speaks. Now, let's go ahead and set the scene for you. Number one, Jerusalem has been attacked, Zechariah 14, 1 and 2. The Jews cry out to the Messiah, Zechariah 12, 10, Matthew 23, 39. You will not see me again until you say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. No, in other words, until the Jews welcome me, the Messiah. Number three, Yeshua responds to their cry, and he comes to fight as a man of war, Zechariah 14, 3 and 4, Revelation 19, 11. He comes with King of Kings, Lord of Lords, written in blood on his thighs. Number four, he takes over as King of Jerusalem, and he makes Israel the capital of the world. Zechariah 14, 9, that says, and in that day his name shall be one all over the world. V'yom hayu yeh Adonai echad. There'll be one God. And he will vanquish the false Messiah, the beast, and he's going to set up his kingdom. Now, on that first Feast of Tabernacles, he demands that the nations come to Jerusalem, as we said earlier. And this could be delegations. I don't think you can fit the whole world of survivors in Jerusalem. And he brings them to Jerusalem, and then he begins to have a conversation with them as he judges the nations. And his conversation is about how did you treat the least of my brothers? Now, I know how we always look at the parable of the sheep and the goats as the poor and the hurting among us. Now, by the way, the Bible is very clear. We're called to help the poor of every nation. But specifically here, he says the least of these brothers of mine. So Yeshua is in Israel, and he's pointing to his physical brothers, the Jewish people who have also survived the second coming, many of them who became born again at the second coming. And he points to these poor, broken people, the ones who did not become believers yet, who have suffered. And he says, how did you treat them? Now, when you think of those who are naked, poor, in prison, concentration camps, you know, you can, sick. I mean, it's a picture of the Holocaust and what Jewish people went through. And he's asking the nations, how did you treat my physical brothers? Did you buy into the anti-Semitism? And by the way, friends, it is invading the church. Right now, as we speak, it is invading the church. There are more and more anti-Semitic YouTube sensations that call themselves Christians, and they teach hatred against the Jewish people. I believe that there is going to be a line of separation. Just as I don't believe you can be pro-choice and on fire for God, I don't think you can hate the Jewish people and be a believer. God will separate those two groups in the end times, I believe. And so you don't want to be a part of that group that is hating the physical brothers. Now, listen, it's not that we're perfect. It's not that Jewish people we're not. It's a matter of calling. And God raised up the Jewish people to be a blessing to you. Because of Israel, you have a Messiah, you have a Bible, you have eternal life. So now God looks to you and he says, take care of my brothers. Yeshua says, take care of my physical brothers. Reach out to them, love them, share with them the message of Messiah. And I believe specifically, if one group of people could fit that description in Matthew 25, it's Holocaust survivors. So I am asking you right now, as we close out this broadcast, to make a generous donation. Go to standwithmmi.org and choose Holocaust survivors. It's the very first one in the list. And we are going to get help. We're going to get those funds within the next few days to those on the ground in Israel to bless Holocaust. Holocaust survivors. We are believing for $10,000 tonight. I know we can do that. I know you can do that. Together we can make a difference in the lives of the last generation of Holocaust survivors. Just 100,000 still alive in Israel today. So that is all the time that we're going to take tonight. I want to thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I really bless you. I love you. I release the grace of God on you. And I do know this, that as you bless Israel, God is going to bless you. It's just one of those great and awesome principles that when you stand with Abraham and his seed, God is going to stand with you. If you don't mind, please share this broadcast on your timeline. Just click the share button below, click the like. And if you're on our page, the Ron Kenner page, please like that. You can find us at messiahsmandate.org. And if you go ahead and join our mailing list, we're going to send you a free book I wrote on end times revival. God bless you. And let's just take a moment right now and end in prayer for those survivors who are still with us. Father, in the name of Yeshua, we just ask that you would touch these precious, precious people, 100,000 in Israel, 100,000 all over the world. Bless them. Reveal to them right now in their final years on earth, Yeshua the Messiah. Let them see that you love them, that you care for them, even after what they've been through, God. Show them Yeshua. Let them see him. Let them know him, oh God. Provide for them everything that they need and help us believers to be a blessing to them, to continue to love them in the name of Yeshua. Amen. Thank you so much. God bless you. Shalom, shalom.